One of the things that I'd like to address, and I'm actually going back, we will see Jesus encountering the multitudes. And so one of the questions people ask is, what does that mean? What is a multitude? For example, how many people are pressing around Jesus when he takes the boat out and they get the fish and so on? How many people are there? Is it hundreds or thousands, or is it just a throng of people, like 10,000 people crowding around him? And why, if we're talking hundreds or thousands of people, and if Jesus is performing all these miracles, why are the Jewish leaders, not to mention the Romans, not taking more notice of him? Why not go ahead and arrest him instead of risking the rise of another Baptist? In our day, a multitude of people consists of at least 10,000 or more people. And most movies about the life of Jesus portray him as surrounded by throngs of people very early in his ministry. However, this is doubtless an exaggeration. On most occasions, when we see the crowds respond to what he's doing, the evangelist is referring to the locals within the community. So usually, whenever a crowd, aklos, is mentioned in the narrative, we're dealing with no more than 30 or 40 people in any given scene. Sometimes as many as 100, hardly ever more than 500, though that probably happened on occasion. Robert Lindsey, a synoptic specialist and linguist who taught in Israel, wrote the following. And so here's what Lindsey writes about this. He says, "My own encounter with the strong Hebraism of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke came several years ago when I had occasion to attempt a translation of the Gospel of Mark to Hebrew. What first caught my attention was the very Hebraic word order of the Greek text of Mark. Usually, I only needed to find the correct Hebrew equivalents to the Greek words in order to give good sense and understanding of the text. In other words, the syntax or word relationships were just such as one would expect in Hebrew. All of this was particularly surprising to me, for I remembered the problems I had as a student studying classical Greek and trying to juggle the words of Xenophon, Homer, Aeschylus, and Plato into the patterns of word order that English demands. What difficulty I had in making those ancient Greeks speak English. So this is the problem of all translation, right? And now translating New Testament Greek into Hebrew, I was finding Greek written as if it were Hebrew. Of course, there are many other indications of the Hebrew origin of our gospel sources. I like to remember how a bright young Israeli student of mine gave me the clue to the meaning of the strange Greek word akoloi, multitudes. This word appears frequently in the Gospels, yet students and scholars alike have been puzzled because the translation multitudes seems rarely, if ever, to fit the context. One day I mentioned in a lecture that I did not understand the odd use of akoloi, nor why it should appear in the plural. "Ah," this young woman responded. "That sounds exactly like the usage of the rabbis when they talk in the ancient writings of a given place. Their word is aklasim, a plural form, but which, of course, simply means the people of the locality." Almost certainly the student was correct. In the story of the deliverance of a demonized man by Jesus, both Matthew and Luke say that when the demons emerged from the man, the akoloi marveled. The clear meaning is not multitudes, but is, as we should say in English, those standing by. Even the feeding of the 5,000, where both Matthew and Luke again combined to say that the akoloi followed him, and where indeed there was a large crowd, it seems better to translate Matthew 14:19 as he commanded the people present to sit down rather than he commanded the multitudes to sit down. After all, it was just one multitude, not several. Akoloi is simply the literal Greek rendering of a Hebrew text which had aklosim, the people of the area. And this, of course, offers us some evidence for our contention that Matthew wrote a proto-gospel in Hebrew or Aramaic, which was used by Peter and written down by Mark as he preached to Jews in Rome. In any event, with few exceptions, I translate akolos or aklos as those present or those standing by. Thus, I surmise that the crowd who gathered around Jesus on this day were about maybe 20 people. I'm not going to make it more than 50. Of course, attracting 20 to 30 people on any given occasion, and sometimes drawing crowds of around 500, is no small feat for a first-century Jewish carpenter. Indeed, Jesus was eventually supported by Joanna, wife of Cusa, even becoming a curiosity to the tetrarch himself. So again, even when we take the correct meaning of the term aklos into account, why were the Jewish leaders, or even the Romans, not more intrigued by Jesus early on in his ministry? For that matter, why is there not more written about Jesus in secular histories? We only have a mention of Jesus in two major historians that we know of. Now, even when we account for arguments from silence, right, and even when we account for lost information, that's still surprising, isn't it, a little bit? Just a little? Maybe? Who knows? Well, Josh McDowell and Bill Wilson write this. They say, despite the fact that the word was getting around that Jesus was attracting a following, the Romans and their chroniclers would not have paid much attention for at least two reasons. First, just as in our own times, the first century secular press did not take seriously any testimony to supernatural phenomena. Those who produced the secular literature of first century Palestine were more concerned about major political events and personalities. To them, Jesus would have been no more than an obscure itinerant preacher from an almost unknown city, Nazareth, who was crucified for causing a minor disturbance which only briefly involved the Roman governor. Likewise, the Jewish leaders and the journalists probably would have viewed Jesus as one of many backwards preachers simply trying to attract attention by claiming to be the Messiah. The second reason Jesus would not have caused much concern among Romans is that the Romans had more pressing problems. If they were to be concerned about crowds in Galilee, it would not be over the unarmed peasants who occasionally came to see Jesus in and around Capernaum. Approximately 5 miles east of Capernaum, across the northern tip of the Sea of Galilee, stood the mountain fortress of Gamala. About 5 miles to the southwest, the Arbel Cliffs towered above the Sea of Galilee. Both Arbel and Gamala were zealot strongholds. The Romans would be much more concerned about the activities of these locations than they would about any religious teachers roaming the countryside. Some 70 years earlier, a number of rebels jumped to their death from the Arbel Cliffs rather than submit to Herod. About 35 years after Jesus' crucifixion, 5,000 zealot terrorists at Gamala would jump to their death rather than submit to the Romans. The first century Jewish historian Josephus tells us that in AD 6, Judas the Gaulonite, of a city whose name was Gamala, led an armed resistance against the Romans, which was brutally crushed. Josephus identifies this Judas as the author of a forced sect of the Jews, which he does not name, but he obviously is referring to the Zealots. Jesus would have been about 10 years old, and the continuous bloody defeats of the Zealot bands must have been a vivid illustration to him of the type of movement that would eventually fail. The Romans, then, would not see a military threat in Jesus and his followers. If they had, they would have crucified Jesus' disciples along with him. Therefore, from the Roman perspective, classify the Zealots under surveillance, classify Jesus harmless. Jesus was careful not to attract attention to himself along the lines of popular messianic expectations. Why does he constantly tell people, don't go tell anybody about this? He consistently told Jewish people whom he healed not to tell everyone or anyone. And when the people wanted to make him a king, he left them. He did not speak of himself to large groups as Messiah, for the Jewish leaders believed that Messiah was to be a ruling king who would deliver his people from oppression. And the Romans knew that that is what they believed. It is in marked contrast that Jesus tells the healed demoniac to go home to his non-Jewish community and tell him what God had done for him. They did not have the same messianic expectations as the Jewish people. And I point out that the same can be said of the Samaritaness. So why is Jesus very clearly and unambiguously telling the Samaritaness, I am the Messiah? But he doesn't clearly say that to the Jews. When the crowds became too large, Jesus retreated with his disciples to the countryside on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. It seems Jesus lived his life on earth with a profound consciousness of the mustard seed parable. During his lifetime, his kingdom would be small and relatively unnoticed. Later, it would become like a tree which spreads its branches over all other plants in the garden. Thoughts about that? To me, that was one of the most important insights I ever received as a young student in the Bible, in making sense out of all this. And I don't think that people read the New Testament carefully enough. So when they portray Jesus doing things, I mean, he's literally looking at thousands of people everywhere he goes. I mean, these cities had, 1,500 here, 1,000 here. Some of these cities were extremely small. Bethlehem had 300 people, maybe 1,000 at any given time. So you're just not going to have throngs and throngs of people. You're going to have, if we went back to the first century, what will we probably see? We go back and so let's say we go to Nazareth or we go to Capernaum at any given time. Most of the time when Jesus would come into a city, we would see him teaching about 20 to 30 people, and most other people walking by and going, what a moron. That's what we would have seen. And it's hard for us to imagine because he's so important to us. But he was a nobody. He was just a deluded fool who thought he was a Messiah or whatever he thinks he is. I have better things to do with my life. I got fish to catch. I got to get food on the table. I just don't have time for that religious claptrap. I'm sick and tired of the Pharisees. I'm sick and tired of the Sadducees. Enough of it. God has forgotten us under this Roman yoke. That's how most people thought about the world. They just didn't take it all that seriously. Kind of like a lot of people that go to church today. They don't take really seriously the idea that God's hand is on their life. And so if a prophet does come into our midst, only a handful of people are going to follow him in the first place, right? He's not going to have a huge following, which is another reason not to take Benny Hinn seriously. Okay, how we doing? I do personally think that when Peter says, "Forgive me, Lord, I'm a sinful man," I think that that's his conversion experience. Now you might say, but he's been a disciple. Yeah, so? This is an example of how you can be a disciple for days, months, even years, and still not be saved. And of course, when he says, "I'm a sinful man," the text says that amazement had seized him and all his companions because of the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus says to Simon, "Do not fear. From now on, you'll be catching men." I see this as reiterating the point that he said at the very beginning of the call. He calls all the disciples, "I'm going to make you fishers of men." Here he says directly to Peter, this is what this is all about. I'm going to make you fishers of men. Why does this miracle evoke such a dramatic response of fear and confession from Peter? Especially if all the disciples present had already seen miracles in Cana and Jerusalem. Have you ever wondered that? If my harmony is correct, we've already seen miracles, why is Peter reacting in this way? He's already seen this kind of thing. He's already seen water to wine. Right? He's already seen at Jesus' suggestion that a man in another city be healed. One answer may be that Luke simply omits prior signs for narrative focus. However, a more compelling possibility is that this particular miracle impacted the disciples in a deeply personal way. This is no mere coincidence and is more than a party trick, more than a healing. Jesus is proving himself to have the power to meet even our most basic needs, even to put food on the table. Jesus provided for their material needs in abundance, so much so that the nets began to break and the boats began to sink. The amazement might be captured in the thought, is there anything impossible for this man to do? A statement which strongly suggests prior experiences with miracles. There may be a subtler issue at play, which some films have explored, though there is scant New Testament evidence for it, and that is that Simon and Andrew may have been facing financial troubles during this time. He clearly owns a house, even one large enough to accommodate Jesus and many, if not all, of his disciples. Hence, they are men of some means. However, they are not rich. They worked hard for everything they had, and yet it is clear that on occasion they sometimes came up short, especially when it involved paying taxes. And we have a story of Peter having a hard time paying a tax and Jesus helping him. We can imagine as Simon and Andrew initially left their boats to follow Jesus full time, they had worries. Perhaps Simon was saying, who will look after my wife while I'm gone for multiple weeks at a time? Who will tend to my business? How will I pay my taxes? How will my wife fare financially while I'm gone? I tend to think that while Jesus is finishing his lesson along the shore, he read Simon's thoughts. And so he miraculously brought in a catch that would give Simon's family financial peace for years. If my interpretation is true, Simon's confession to Jesus is not merely a reference to his mild protest. Master, we've been up all night. Yeah. But an acknowledgement of his unwarranted worry, along with his refusal to cast all of his cares upon his new master. This take on the narrative also highlights Jesus' comforting words to Simon, do not fear, for you will now be a catcher of men. First, there is no reason to fear for finances, for health, for basic needs. For once you have established a relationship with God, there's nothing this world can throw at you that will ever do you permanent harm. And that includes death itself, which is nothing if God is not on our. It's nothing if God is on our side. Second, your days of fishing are not over, for just as you have had a huge catch today, which no one can possibly fathom, how much more will your catch be of men? Jesus' prediction is initially fulfilled on the day of Pentecost, when through his sermon, Peter caught over 3,000 people. So, thoughts about that? This is the breaking point. The text goes on to say in Luke 5, when they had brought their nets, when they brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. I have a wonderful Edersheim quote that gets into that, but I'm not going to get into it this evening because we need to move on. But before I go to the first exorcism, any questions about this call narrative in Luke 5 and its parallels in Mark and Matthew? I will take that as a no. So they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and began to teach. And they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Ha, let us alone! What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Hast thou come to destroy us? I know who thou art. We know who thou art, the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet, and come out of him." And throwing himself into convulsions, when the demon had thrown him down in the midst of the people, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him, without doing him, the possessed man, any harm. And amazement came upon them all. And they were all amazed, so that they debated amongst themselves. And they began talking with one another, saying, "What is this message? A new teaching with authority. For with authority and power he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." and come out of those possessed. Immediately the news about him spread everywhere into all the surrounding district of Galilee. And I'm going to stop right here. Significance. Why would this be the very first miracle that Mark records for us? And y'all find that interesting? So in John, it's water to wine, but in Mark, it's the casting out of a demon.
To build on his point, what is conversion and what is transition?
So conversion and transition. So unpack that. So the answer is the reason Mark chooses this to be the first miracle is we want a transition. This is a transitional phase miracle. So explain.
To go from demon-possessed to not demon-possessed isn't necessarily changing the substance, but it's more of a transition of the same thing. So it would kind of be like one would be I can't hear you.
Say it. It's the transference of kingdoms. So what is Jesus proclaiming in Mark's gospel? He says, repent and believe because the kingdom of God is at hand. The inbreaking of the kingdom consists not just in him toppling political thrones, but spiritual forces. And the point that Mark is making is that Jesus' kingdom is first and foremost a spiritual kingdom. I point out that the first miracle recorded in Mark is an exorcism, and Luke is following the same pattern. He follows Mark here. Jesus' power of the spiritual realm bears implicit witness to his deity. This is not merely because he casts out demons, but because he does so without ritual, incantation, or external aid. The unclean spirit is expelled by the authority of his word alone. Leave. Get out of him. The crowd's astonishment. What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey. It's not easy to do. Who can just look at someone and go, leave to an unclean spirit? I mean, even our fiction has, priests trying to get a demon out of somebody, and they just can't do it. So for 2 hours, you deal with a demon-possessed person, and we all implicitly realize, if you go to Satan and say, stop it, he's not going to stop it. He's not going to just get up and go, oh, you said stop it. Okay, but they obey Jesus.
If you just go up and rationally explain behind every word there's a coward, Satan's just going to back off.
That's right, exactly. Why does Jesus command the demon to be silent? Many Markan scholars are going to argue that this is part of a messianic secret motif that we find in Mark, but Bach, I think, gives a better explanation. He says, Jesus is a threat to the spirit. The mood of the scene is one of spiritual combat. The mere presence of Jesus raises the tension for this unclean spirit. Part of Jesus' mission in bringing the kingdom is to defeat the influence of malevolent forces. The encounter, then, is a visual expression of what Jesus is about. His miracles in general are powerful points. This is part of what John the Baptist meant in referring to Jesus as the stronger one. The scene makes sense in a context where Jesus' authority is the point. More than his ideas is meant in his authority. His person is what counts for Mark. Jesus acts. He rebukes the spirit to silence and commands him to depart. The call to silence is not unusual for an exorcism. It was a common way to exert control in an exorcism. Right? So he's not saying be silent because I don't want anybody to know I'm the Messiah. He's saying be silent because I have authority over your speech. It's you have to be a very powerful agent to have authority over the speech of another person. You're a shade away from having power over their thoughts. And so the fact that Jesus says silence and they are silent means he has absolute authority over them. That's power. That is tremendous power. The only difference is that here, in contrast to other exorcisms, it is a demon who is muzzled in the exercise of power. As such, appeals to any messianic secret for this scene are exaggerated and may ignore the cultural context. But there is a silencing here. It is not that Jesus is trying to not disclose something, as the demon has already spoken. It is that Jesus desires to stop the demon's activity, verbal and otherwise. Important to note is that there is no incantation or any appeal that involves intermediary authority or magic. His word alone bears authority. And I point out here that just as the Johannine miracles can all be seen as proclamations of Jesus' messiahship and divinity, the water to wine proclaims the inbreaking of the kingdom, the prophetic knowledge reveals Jesus' ability to read the human heart, the healing of the nobleman's son from a distance reveals the power of the divine word Jesus possesses. So also here, in Mark's first recorded miracle, a precedent is set for asking the all-important question, what sort of person does this man have to be in order to do these things? To speak with absolute authority and to back up his speech with effectual commandments against the forces of evil. Surely the king has arrived. This is the servant of the Lord that the Lord predicted in the prophecies. He's here. And that takes us back to this really interesting line. They say, we know who you are. You are the Holy One of God. What does that mean? What are they recognizing? And it's clear that they are recognizing nothing short of his deity. So I've already given you evidence in Mark's gospel that Mark teaches the deity of Christ. In this story, we have another piece of evidence in Mark's gospel of the deity of Christ. Bowman and Komashevsky, they make 2 points. First, this is the first miracle Mark records, and so Mark is making the point that before Jesus does anything, the demons know who he is. Think about that. Before he does anything, they know who he is. And second, the reason the demons call out Jesus' name is they are trying to gain control over him. Just as the typical first century exorcist calls out the name of a demon in an attempt to cast it out. It's very important that you be able to name something. To name something just is to control the narrative. To name something just is to have power over it. And this is why all through Genesis 1, God is calling the elements that he's bringing into existence their name. The name is his authority. The naming function of God in that text is the authority he has over the elements. And so when the demons say, we know who you are, you're the Holy One of God, that is their attempt to gain control over him. But it reveals something a little bit more deep than that. Bowman and Komashevsky note, these two aspects of Jesus' confrontations with demons provide good evidence that the demons knew Jesus from the spiritual realm. Apparently, even before he had begun casting out demons or performing other miracles, Jesus' encounters with the demons are episodes of cosmic conflict with spiritual powers in which Jesus is characterized much more like a heavenly figure than a human figure in his confrontation with evil spirits. Thus, these accounts of Jesus' encounters with demons imply that he had come from heaven. How else do they know him from the spiritual realm? How do they know him before he does anything? Because he pre-existed his incarnation. Komashevsky and Bowman say, They know him as someone who was a pre-existent spiritual being who was now active in the human world, not by demonic possession, but by having himself become human. Notice also that Jesus is called by these demons the Holy One of God, significant for two reasons. First, the evil spirits are recognizing his purity. As Bach notes, this is a case of purity facing off with impurity. And second, it is a recognition on their part that Jesus is the Christ and the unique Son of God. In every place in the Old Testament where the phrase Holy One is used, it refers to Jehovah. Every single place. This must mean minimally that Jesus is holy or set apart from all others, since he has a relationship with God that is utterly unique. While it is an overstatement to see in this title an explicit affirmation of Jesus' full deity, it indicates a closeness between God and Jesus that no one else has. And context demands that this relationship was before Jesus' own birth. This exposes the lie that in the other Gospels, Jesus comes down from heaven in John, or he's virgin born in the others. But in Mark, he's just a human Jesus. In this story that occurs in the first chapter of Mark, we have the demonic realm recognizing him, which strongly implies that they already knew him from the spiritual realm. They get who he is. Okay, so he gets up and he leaves the synagogue, and immediately after they came out of the synagogue, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a high fever, and immediately they spoke to Jesus about her. And they asked him to help her, and he came to her, and standing over her, he touched her hand, he rebuked the fever, and taking her by the hand, raised her up, and it left her. And she immediately got up, and she waited on them, so that what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled. He himself took on our infirmities and carried away our diseases. Now, what text is Matthew quoting here? Is Isaiah 53. So you'll notice that Mark doesn't quote Isaiah 53, but all four Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, quote Isaiah 53 saying Jesus fulfilled that prophecy, and Mark alludes to it in Mark 10:45. It's a very important point. He's a progressive pastor. I recently heard him, I forget these people's names. Is it Brandon Robinson? He was the, Brandon
Robinson?
Yeah, I think Brandon Robinson. So I got the name right. He said, yeah, I don't believe that Jesus fulfilled Isaiah 53. Okay, fine. You don't believe that. But in saying that, you're saying that all four Gospels are wrong, fundamentally wrong, about Jesus. So, that's a very striking claim. In fact, all four Gospel writers, especially Matthew, Luke, and John, they go out of their way to make it very explicit that Jesus fulfilled the prophecy, so much so that in Acts chapter 8, we have a story of Philip meeting the Ethiopian eunuch and introducing him to who fulfills this text. Now, again, I'm not going to defend the idea that Jesus fulfilled Isaiah 53. It's just, except to say that all the gospel writers think he did. It's pretty plain that they think he did. But here's something about the historicity of the text. Now, can we prove that it actually happened? That Jesus went into Peter's home and cured the mother-in-law? Well, obviously not, absolutely. But here's the surprising fact. A number of New Testament scholars who are willing to grant that Jesus actually cured people, often in the extraordinary way his healings are portrayed in the Gospels. So if you were to go to the majority of critical scholars and you were to say, did Jesus heal people? The majority would say, yeah. This is fascinating to me. It's so fascinating to me because, Bart Ehrman is a little upset about it. So in one of his books, Bart Ehrman attacks his colleagues. So I'm like, why are you buying into this? So Bart Ehrman would be one of those critical scholars who says, no, Jesus didn't do this sort of thing. But most scholars believe. So Marcus Borg, in his book that he co-writes with N.T. Wright, he says, I see the miracle stories of healings as history remembered, and then he goes on to say Jesus must have been a remarkable healer. And I point out that even the majority of the members of the extremely skeptical Jesus Seminar grant the basic historicity of this event. That's pretty amazing to me. Concerning Mark 1:30 through 31, and this is what they say, this is what the text says. Now Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a fever, and they immediately spoke to Jesus about her, and he came to her and raised her up, and taking her by the hand, and the fever left her, and she served them. The seminar comments on the simplicity and dissimilarity of this story. So here's what the seminar says about the story. The fellows were all but unanimous that this bit of the narrative information was reliable. They were all but unanimous. That means that the vast majority of them said, this happened. The evidence is overwhelming that Jesus was regarded as a healer during his public career. However, it is difficult to identify stories in the Gospels that are reports of actual healing events. This brief vignette comes as close to any to qualifying as a report of an actual happening. The version Mark records lacks most of the features that are characteristic of stereotyped healing stories. There's no comment on the gravity of the malady. Jesus gives no command. The faith of the recipient is not remarked. And there's no one present to register amazement and confirm the cure. Further, there are no precedents in Hebrew scripture of which this story could be the imitation. And there are no allusions to stories involving Elijah and Elisha, and no reference to cures of this type in catalogs of eschatological healings, such as we find in Isaiah. In some, this simple tale appears to reflect the memory of a cure worked upon someone close to the inner circle of Jesus' followers. It does not appear to be fictive, and accordingly, the fellows designated the gist of the story pink. And as you know, when they voted on what they think Jesus said and did, red means he said it. Red means he did it. Pink means he did something like this. The story may not be true in all of its details. The quotation may not be absolutely perfect, but this captures the gist of what happened. The fact that even extremely skeptical New Testament scholars concede the basic historicity of this cure is itself good reason to see the historical Jesus as a man who performed extraordinary deeds, if not outright miracles, throughout his life. Of course, the seminar is only willing to accept the gist of the story as historical. As the reader can plainly see, they are not even sure if it was Jesus' mother-in-law who was cured. Also, the fellows of the seminar were dubious that the location of the cure was Simon's house in Capernaum. I find this strange, since the locale is one of the more believable aspects of the story. Indeed, there is strong, even if inconclusive, reason to think archaeologists have discovered the home of Simon Peter. I don't know if y'all knew this. In fact, if you want to get on YouTube, Frank Turek is out in Israel right now, and he's filming stuff, and he has a short where he's in Peter's home. There's been a church that's been built on top of that. This has been well known for a long time. And so I give you the reference here where you can go and read about it. And it's not the only place you can go and read about it. Indeed, while discussing the healing of the paralytic, which also takes place in Simon's home, the fellows concede that the locale of the story is plausible. They conclude with this curious remark. Now, this is the Jesus seminar talking. Recent archaeological work in Capernaum has unearthed a house dating to the 1st century CE. The claim has been made that this house is Simon Peter's house, the very house referred to in the story of the paralytic. If the seminar is willing to accept what is most extraordinary about the narratives, the cure of a woman, the healing of a paralytic, how much more should they concede the setting of the story, a setting confirmed by archaeological discovery? And I do make the note that even if the discovery is not, in fact, Simon's home, it does confirm that houses like the one described in Mark did exist in Capernaum at that time. Mark suggests that the home of Simon and Andrew was relatively spacious, further indicating that the sons of Jonah were men of some means, and yet they were far from rich. Also, the fact that Peter is still taking care of his mother-in-law is a strong indication that, later tradition notwithstanding, Peter never forsook his wife to follow Jesus. Indeed, we know that all married apostles took their wives with them on their missionary journeys after the resurrection. There's no reason to think matters were any different throughout Jesus' ministry. God does not ask his people to forsake their covenantal relationships and moral obligations for the sake of the kingdom. Far from it. Living up to those obligations and keeping those covenants is part and parcel of what it means to live in the kingdom. Okay. Are y'all surprised by this, that the Jesus seminar actually thinks that the story happened? That blew me away when I found out about this.
I'm surprised they think anything, actually.
Sure.
Like, they just relativist everything.
Oh, sure. They think that they relativize everything. They think that over 80% of the sayings of Jesus and the deeds of Jesus in the Gospels were never said or done by him. And they start with the assumption that the New Testament can't be trusted, and so it has to prove itself to them. They don't start with basic reliability and move from there.
Start with the assumption that both things can't be trusted.
Anybody else?
Tim, are you saying that it's the seminar itself that is saying it's not sure if it's Jesus' mother-in-law who appeared, or is that just...
I wasn't trying to communicate that. They're not sure if it was Peter's. Did I say Jesus?
Yeah, the harmony says Jesus' mother-in-law.
Could you give me the...
Of course, the seminar is only willing to accept the gist of the story that's historical. As the readers can plainly see, they're not even sure if it was Jesus' mother-in-law.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the typo, Peter.
That's what I thought.
So, we're going to go ahead and end